Hello friends, this is Mr. Kamlakar Ruge, Assistant Professor, MJ Autonomous College, Jalgaon. Friends, in this video lecture, we shall be looking at the essay written by Sir Philip Sidney entitled An Apology for Poetry. So let's begin. At the very outset, we shall be looking at the backdrop of writing an apology for poetry. The first thing which inspired Sir Philip Sidney to write an apology for poetry was that the Elizabethan age and the then literary climate. The work was written around 1580 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This was the Renaissance period in England, a time of revival of classical learning, humanism, and flourishing arts. Poetry, drama, and prose were gaining immense popularity, but the status of poetry was contested. Some praised it highly, others criticized it as morally corrupting or frivolous. Next to it, we have that the attack on poetry by Stephen Gosson. So the immediate trigger for Sidney's essay was Stephen Gosson's pamphlet that was The School of Abuse, which was published in the year 1579. So in his work or in his pamphlet, Stephen Gosson condemned poetry, music, and theatre as follows. He said that these types of art are corrupting public morals, they are encouraging idleness and promoting immorality. He saw poetry as a vain entertainment rather than serious knowledge. So, to answer the pamphlet of Gosser, Sidney, being a nobleman, courtier, soldier, and poet, felt that the need to defend poetry against such moral and intellectual attacks. Hence, he wrote an apology for poetry, primarily circulated in manuscript in 1580s and published posthumously in 1595. Throughout this work, his aim was to show poetry's moral, philosophical, and educational value, place poetry above philosophy and history in terms of usefulness, and to defend English poetry against charges of weakness compared to classical literature. So when we look at the influence he got from classical thinkers to write his work, that is an apology for poetry, was that he drew inspiration from Aristotle's Poetics, for as Ars Poetica, and Renaissance critics like Scaliger and Minturno. He also interpreted their ideas in the English context, giving poetry the role of teaching and delighting. So, as it was the broader debate, Sidney's essay was a part of a wider European debate on the role of art and literature during the Renaissance. The central question was, does poetry corrupt or uplift the society? Sidney argued that poetry, when rightly practiced, is the most noble form of learning because it both teaches and delights, thus moving men to virtue. In short, we can say that Sidney wrote an apology for poetry as a defense against puritanical and moral attacks on poetry, especially Gosson's critique, while also situating poetry within the Renaissance humanist tradition of intellectual and moral enrichment. Now let us look at the content of this manuscript, that is an apology for poetry by Sir Philip Sidney. In his work, An Apology for Poetry, Sir Philip Sidney defends poetry against its critics and seeks to restore it to as its rightful place as the highest of the arts. In Elizabethan England, poetry had begun to lose respect, but Sidney argues that this was because people had misunderstood its true nature. Bad poetry gave poetry a bad name, but genuine poetry, he says, is noble and valuable. Further, Sidney follows the classical style of oration. In his introduction, he recalls how his riding master, Pogliano, praised horsemanship, and he too feels compelled to defend his vocation as a poet. He begins by reminding readers that poetry is the oldest of the arts, older than philosophy and history. Even philosophers like Plato and historians like Herodotus wrote in poetic style. In the ancient worlds, poets were called waits. It means prophets or says, and poetas, which means makers, makers of the society. These names show the divine and creative role of the poet who, like God, can imagine and create better versions of reality. Sidney defines poetry as an art of imitation that teaches through delight. For him, poetry is like a speaking picture, combining pleasure with instruction. Unlike philosophy, which deals with abstract ideas, or history, which deals with facts, poetry is free to create perfect examples of virtue that inspire people to live better lives. Through stories and characters, poetry makes virtue both attractive and memorable, like moral lessons hidden in sweet cherries. For this reason, the poet is the right popular philosopher, according to Sir Philip Sidney, who is capable of moving readers more deeply than any historian philosophers. Throughout his work, Sidney addresses the common criticism of poetry by saying that it is a waste of time, that poets are liars, the poetry corrupts morals, that Plato banished poets in the public. Sidney argues that all these criticisms actually prove poetry's power. Poetry can influence people strongly, and if used well, it leads them towards virtue rather than vice. In conclusion, Sidney admits that much English poetry of his own time is poor. But this is not the fault of the English language, which he believes is rich and capable of greatness. The fault lies with poets who imitate classical works very poorly. If poets improve their craft, English poetry can equal or surpass that of the ancients. Sidney ends with a warning by saying that poetry can immortalize heroes in verse, but it can also condemn critics to oblivion by refusing to mention them. Thus, Sidney's apology reclaims poetry as the monarch of the arts, a divine, delightful, and powerful teacher of virtue. That's it for today, friends. Thank you very much for watching my video. If you like my video, please like, share, and comment. And please do not forget to subscribe my channel. Thank you. Keep watching, keep studying. Thank you very much.